Hello there. In this video, I'm going to talk about the St.Clair Streetcar, a streetcar that is known for many things, including its right-of-way and the construction of it, or the fact that it is nearly completely isolated from the rest of the streetcar network. But it didn't always used to be this way. So, let's get into the video. The origins of the St.Clair Streetcar dates back to the early 1900s. St.Clair Avenue by this point had already developed as a major east-west artery with many communities and villages springing up along its length. These communities would be annexed by the city of Toronto, and naturally the city wished for these newly annexed neighborhoods to have transit access. This wasn't happening though, as by this time the Toronto Railway Company was in the latter years of its operating charter and didn't wish to invest money into expanding the network when they knew they may not reap the benefits of it. The TRC would argue that the operating charter only applied to areas outlined in 1891 and not the newly annexed areas. It was this argument with the TRC that would ultimately convince the city not to renew the operating contract in 1921 and instead take control of the streetcar network. In the meantime though, the city wasn't content to just wait for the operating charter to expire and would opt to get ahead of the issue and in 1911 establish a municipally owned operator, the Toronto Civic Railway. The TCR would get to work constructing multiple routes around the city, one of which would be on St.Clair Avenue. Construction would start in September of 1911 with work beginning at Yonge Street and moving west. A material yard would be set up at the west end of the planned line near Davenport Road and the Grand Trunk Railway tracks. While St. Clair is a largely straight road, it does pass through some hilly terrain such as the Nordheimer Ravine at Bathurst Street. Construction on the line would prove to be a bit of a nightmare, with the Nordheimer Ravine proving to be the biggest problem. Engineers would realize trying to fill the ravine was a fruitless endeavor and would instead choose to construct a bridge over the ravine. Construction would finish 2 years later, with the TCR opting to construct a temporary bridge over the Nordheimer Ravine with a gauntlet track being laid over the bridge. A more permanent bridge would open on June 20th, 1914. Service would officially begin on the St.Clair Streetcar on August 25th, 1913, with the route operating from a crossover at Yonge Street to a crossover at the Grand Trunk Railway tracks at Caledonia Road. Cars would operate along a private right-of-way down the middle of St.Clair Avenue, with the route operating at 6-minute intervals. This would be increased to 1 car every 2 minutes in 1918. Cars would be stored at the newly built St. Clair Car House, sometimes called Witchwood Car House. The St. Clair Streetcar would also be unique in the TCR network, being the only one with a transfer to another TCR line, that being the Lansdowne Streetcar. On December 26, 1921, after the Toronto Transportation Commission was founded, the St. Clair Streetcar would be temporarily cut back to a crossover at Avenue Road, while service beyond to the newly constructed Caledonia Loop was handled by the Avenue Road Streetcar. By July 1, 1923, the St. Clair Streetcar service beyond Avenue Road would be restored, with the route now operating to Caledonia Loop. As well, the eastern end of the route would be extended north up Yonge Street to the newly built Lawton Loop around Lawton Boulevard and Glen Elm Avenue. Service west of Avenue Road would also continue to be supplemented by the Avenue Road Streetcar, which was eventually renamed to the Bay Streetcar. The St. Clair Streetcar would see a further extension east on December 1, 1924, when it was extended to Moore Park Loop at Mount Pleasant Road. A year later, on November 4, 1925, the route would be extended even further, this time north along Mount Pleasant Road to Eglinton Loop at Eglinton Avenue, replacing an experimental trolley bus route. In 1928, the TTC would begin the process of tearing out the private right-of-way along St. Clair Avenue and paving it over to make space for cars. By 1935, the entire right-of-way was gone, and this would be a decision the TTC would eventually regret. In 1929, a spur track would be constructed on the line for the construction of the St. Clair Reservoir at Spadina Road. This spur would be commissioned by the city, which would utilize TTC work cars to help deliver supplies and remove materials during construction. This spur would be torn up in 1930 when construction on the reservoir was completed. The tracks west of Caledonia, now owned by CN Rail, proved to be an obstacle for both the St.Clair Streetcar and its riders, who would need to cross the tracks and board the Dovercourt Streetcar at the adjacent Prescott Loop if they wished to continue their journey. This gap would be closed on October 29, 1931, when an underpass opened and the St.Clair Streetcar was extended to Townsley Loop at Old Weston Road. The route would be extended further west a year later on May 14, 1932, when it was extended to the newly built Kiel Loop. While Kiel Loop was the main western terminus of the line, some cars would continue north on Weston Road to Northlands Loop. On September 1, 1943, rush hour service on the St.Clair Streetcar would be extended north along Weston Road to Avon Loop. This rush hour service would be in place until February 25, 1966, when it was ended for good. One interesting feature of the St.Clair Streetcar's route was the sheer number of turnback loops on the line. These include its eastern terminus Eglinton Loop, Moore Park Loop, Lawton Loop, Vaughan Loop, where it connected to the Bathurst streetcar, Oakwood Loop, where it connected to the Oakwood and Rogers Road streetcars, Earls Court Loop, where it connected to the Lansdowne streetcar, Caledonia Loop, the terminus of the Bay streetcar, Townsley Loop, where it connected with the Dovercourt streetcar and eventually Harbord streetcar, Kiel Loop, its western terminus, and lastly Northlands and Avon Loop, which saw limited rush hour services and had connections with the Weston streetcar. The large number of loops came from the fact that for a time St.Clair Avenue was essentially the north end of the city, so many streetcar lines would only go as far north as St. Clair. Those that went beyond were operated by other companies such as the Toronto Suburban Railway. This also meant that for a time the St. Clair Streetcar would be well connected to the rest of the network, a fact that would not remain true coming out of World War II. After World War II, the combination of money issues, the streetcar abandonment policy, and the advent of the Toronto subway would see streetcar routes around Toronto fall in quick succession, and this would in time lead to St. Clair's isolation from the rest of the network. Dovercourt would be the first to go in 1941 when it was replaced with the Harbord streetcar. Lansdowne was abolished in 1947, Weston Road in 1948, Bay and Yonge in 1954, Harbord in 1957, Oakwood in 1961, and Bathurst was cut back to Bathurst Station in 1966. All the tracks these routes ran on, with the exception of Bathurst Street, were also torn up or paved over, which left the St. Clair Streetcar all but isolated from the rest of the network, save for the aforementioned tracks on Bathurst Street. The only other connection left would be the one with the Rogers Road streetcar, which managed to stick around for a bit longer. That said, it wasn't as if the St. Clair Streetcar was completely alone yet, as on March 30th, 1954, it would be joined by the Earls Court Streetcar, which usually operated from St. Clair Station to Earls Court Loop. I say usually because sometimes the routes would alternate which ones terminated at St. Clair Station and which one continued to Eglinton Loop. Rogers Road streetcars would also begin operating to St. Clair Station during rush hour in 1954. The Rogers Road streetcar would continue operating until it was abolished in 1974, leaving St. Clair and Earls Court as the only streetcars left in that part of the city. In 1975, the eastern end of the route between St. Clair Station and Eglinton Loop would be spun off into its own route, giving birth to the Mount Pleasant streetcar. This route was incredibly short-lived though, and after only 15 months of service, it was abolished, and with it all streetcar service along Mount Pleasant Road. Service east of Yonge Street would continue briefly during the overnight, but eventually this would be ended, and all St. Clair and Earls Court cars would terminate at St. Clair Station. The collapse of all of these routes also meant that by 1975 only 3 lines operated out of Wychwood Car House, those being St. Clair, Earls Court, and Bathurst. Seeing this, the TTC would opt to consolidate these routes at Roncesvalles Car House, and so Wychwood would eventually be closed. Going into the 1970s, the route would stabilize, and the construction of the Spadina extension of Line 1 would also finally see the area around the Nordheimer Ravine filled in, as the TRC tried to do in 1911. St. Clair West Station would also feature the first underground streetcar loop in the network. 1978 would mark the end of the St. Clair Streetcar's remaining companion, as the Earls Court Streetcar would be absorbed into the St. Clair Streetcar. This was done mostly because by this point the Earls Court car really made no sense, since it just paralleled the St. Clair Streetcar for its entire route. As well, with the introduction of the CLRV cars, the TTC looked to consolidate routes in order to simplify the new number scheme being rolled out. In this regard, the St. Clair Streetcar would be given the number 512, and the Earls Court service would live on as the 512L for a time, but this branch number and service would eventually disappear. The last major expansion of the 512 St. Clair would come on July 27, 1981, when the route was expanded west from Keel Loop to the newly built Guns Loop at Maybank Road, now called Guns Road. While the 512 St. Clair was done expanding and contracting and now had a stable route, the work on making it the route we know today was far from over. As stated earlier in the video, the St. Clair Streetcar was originally constructed on a dedicated right-of-way down the middle of St. Clair Avenue. This right-of-way was torn up through the 1930s, and by the 70s, the TTC would come to regret this decision. In the 1970s, the TTC would attempt to get cars off the tracks by having yellow stripes painted over the tracks to tell drivers not to drive there, but this would be a futile endeavor. With the success of the rebuilt right-of-way on Spadina Avenue, as well as a brand new one on Queens Quay, the TTC would be motivated to replicate this success on St. Clair Avenue and committed millions of dollars in 2004 to begin the work. This project, simple on paper, would be anything but, and would become a bit of a fiasco, as the TTC and city would soon find out. It's not as if this project was rejected by everyone immediately, as many people in the area came out in support of the project. The tracks along St. Clair at this point needed to be replaced anyways, as they had reached the end of their operating lives. For an additional $7 million, the whole route could be upgraded with a new right-of-way. The whole project was budgeted at $65 million, with a completion date sometime in 2007. Very quickly though, a group called Save Our St. Clair, or SOS for short, would form an opposition of the project. They would primarily take issue with the project as it was presented, and of course the usual arguments also came up, such as loss of parking, etc., etc. A group in opposition to them would also form in support of the St. Clair project, the St. Clair Right-of-Way Initiative for Public Transit, or SCRIPT for short. At meetings, these two groups made up of both residents and business owners in the area would clash, but in the end the city would approve the project and it would clear the Ontario Municipal Board on June 3, 2005, clearing the way for work to begin. In the summer of 2005, Save Our St. Clair would appeal the Municipal Board's decision to the Ontario Court, where they argued the city did not adequately consult with local residents and that they didn't have the authority to make this change to St. Clair Avenue. The first argument came down to the TTC and the city doing a less than ideal job in its community consultation, often dragging their feet on certain decisions. The second argument was built on the fact that building a surface rapid transit line along St. Clair wasn't part of the city's official plan. The thing is, it was, but it was part of the 2002 official plan, which hadn't been approved by the Ontario Municipal Board at the time the St. Clair project was approved. Thus, the City of Toronto was still technically operating under the 1994 official plan, which made no mention of a transit project along St. Clair. So while the argument was made on a huge technicality, it was convincing enough for the Ontario Court to have an injunction granted to stop the project. Supporters for the project would quickly criticize Save Our St. Clair for what they had done, with some even calling for boycotts of businesses that were against the project. The City of Toronto, for its part, would quickly appeal the decision to the Ontario Divisional Court, arguing that one of the judges responsible for the injunction had a conflict of interest, as they lived in the area and had criticized the mayor for another project in the area. Other arguments were made, and in the end the divisional court sided with the city and the injunction was lifted. Save Our St. Clair would not appeal the ruling, and finally the project on St. Clair would begin, although the headaches had only just begun. This whole legal battle would cost taxpayers an additional $2.7 million. Construction on the St. Clair right-of-way would restart in 2006, although the damage had been done as all the tenders for the project had to either be delayed or recalled completely. This delay would cascade through the entire project. The project would be broken into 3 phases, with phase 1 being from Yonge Street to Vaughan Road. This also included the addition of an elevator at St. Clair Station. Luckily, as part of the Spadina subway extension back in 1978, the segment of the route from Bathurst Street to Tweedsmuir Avenue had already been put in a right-of-way as part of the St. Clair West Station construction. In April of 2007, Phase 2 would begin with the rebuild of the underground streetcar loop at St. Clair West Station. This phase would encounter delays as excavation found electrical lines that weren't in the blueprints. Throughout 2008, bad weather in the winter would continue to hamper the project. Phase 3 would commence in September of 2008, and by December of 2009, the right-of-way was largely complete east of Lansdowne Avenue. The TTC would hold a sort of opening ceremony for the project, although work continued west of Lansdowne. Throughout all of this, coordination issues between the TTC and various city departments and contractors would see segments of the project sit idle or be done earlier or later than planned. As well, streetcar service along St. Clair was off and on, with the route at times being replaced by shuttle buses. Work on the project would drag on into 2010, with construction mistakes at Guns Loop being yet another problem in this seemingly endless parade of delays. Service on the entire route would finally be restored on June 30th, 2010, 3 years past its original proposed completion date and at a cost of $106 million. After many years of frustration, the end result for most people was a positive one. The TTC would note that ridership on the 512 St. Clair had increased from 28,500 riders per day in 2005 to 32,400 riders per day in 2011. As well, rush hour travel times on the route had dropped by 8 minutes and a round trip by a full 14 minutes. The TTC would even increase service on the 512, with streetcars operating every 2 minutes and 55 seconds. The city would also note a 40% reduction in vehicular traffic along St. Clair Avenue. For local residents and businesses, most view the project as a success, with some businesses reporting an increase in customers. This, of course, hasn't stopped some from viewing the project as a disaster that, quote-unquote, destroyed St. Clair. The trouble of building the right-of-way would be one used by people opposed to the various LRT projects as part of the Transit City debates, and is to this day still brought up whenever anyone dares talk about building some sort of right-of-way down a major street. In the end, though, most locals today see the St. Clair right-of-way as a net positive for the community, regardless of what the naysayers may think. That's not to say it is immune from criticism. It's no secret that the project was badly managed and the lack of coordination between various groups involved was abysmal, to say the least. There is also still no transit priority signaling on St. Clair, even though it really should have it, so service on the route could be even better than it currently is. This was all outlined in the Lessons Learned report the TTC commissioned in 2012, among other things. This, however, should not be seen as an indictment on the project itself, but on the people and organizations around it. Was the St. Clair project a disaster at the time of its construction? Absolutely. Is it still a disaster today now that it is done? Absolutely not. The future of the 512 St. Clair is hard to gauge, as there has been discussion for a long time about extending the route further west, either to Runnymede Road, Jane Street, or even Scarlett Road. It's just this idea of extending the route is never officially off the table, but isn't on it either. During the early days of the Transit City era, the route was planned to be extended west to Jane Street to connect to the proposed Jane LRT. However, that project too has fallen by the wayside. I personally do believe the St. Clair Streetcar will be extended west one day, although I couldn't tell you where, as the real estate for a turnback loop gets pretty sparse the further west you go. As well, St. Clair Avenue narrows to 4 lanes west of Gunn's Loop, and there doesn't seem to be any room for a road expansion. This means the TTC would have to be content with either extending the 512 in mixed traffic or try to convince the city to reduce St. Clair to a 1 lane in each direction for cars. An extension to Runnymede would likely be the easiest, as the 512 could use the old Runnymede loop at Dundas Street, which was once the terminus for both the Lambton and Dundas streetcars. An extension to Jane Street is usually the one everyone talks about, although it's hard to say where you would turn back the streetcars, say for trying to cram a loop into the grassy area south of the CP rail tracks. An extension to Scarlet may in fact be easier, since a turnback loop can be built at the Scarlet and St. Clair Parquet. This would also bring the streetcar right to the western edge of St. Clair Avenue. Either way though, the 512 St. Clair has come a long way from being a route built to serve the very northern fringe of Toronto to the route it is today. Nearly isolated from the rest of the network, running down a right-of-way, ferrying commuters through the neighborhoods it was built to serve over 100 years ago. And with that, I will end this video here. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it and want to see more like it, please hit that subscribe button because there are more videos like it on the way, and there are more videos like it on the channel. If there's anything you want to say about the St. Clair Streetcar, don't be afraid to do so in the comment section down below. And with that, I will end this video here.